Hey everybody, this is Owen McCafferty for the Film Photography Project, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Cine-Kodak Model K amateur 16mm home movie camera. This camera was introduced in 1930 by Kodak and was in production until 1946, although this Cine-Kodak line was actually introduced in 1923. This format of movie camera survived until Kodak started introducing the 16mm magazine film. This particular model uses double perforated 16mm film. One of the reasons why I'm talking to you about this camera today really is because the FPP, as you may know, is really starting to invest in the home movie format, whether that's 16mm like this camera, Super 8mm, or regular 8mm. And I wanted to show you how to load one of these cameras so you can feel confident in loading cameras of this style. So let's talk about some of the basic features of this 16mm camera. One of the things that's probably most important to note that I just mentioned earlier is that it's a double perforated 16mm camera, meaning it takes double perforated film. You'll see it has two sets of perforations on either side of the film. Modern 16mm film, or most of the 16mm film that you find today, is single perforated. And the reason why it's single perforated usually is so that a soundtrack could be added to the film if need be, or if you're shooting something that's called Super 16mm, which is essentially a camera that can shoot a slightly larger frame, and so that extra frame size is taken up by where the double perforated film, double perforations would normally be. This camera and most cameras of this era take double perforated film, and it's important to know that because a camera that is designed to take double perforated film, and I'll show you why this is important once we look inside the camera, can only take double perforated film unless you actually physically modify it. So if you have, for example, a 16mm camera that takes single perforated film, you could do either. But a double perforated camera can only take double perforated film. Luckily, the FPP carries double perforated film now, which is really exciting. So if you have a camera like this, or certainly a camera from this era, you'll finally be able to purchase film to run in it without having to make any modifications to your camera. Other basic features include the lens, and this particular model features interchangeable lenses that you could purchase. This is the standard lens that comes with it. Like I said, it's a 1.9 25mm lens. And this is the viewfinder. You'll see on top, this is sort of where you would be looking into the camera. That lines up with the other, the sort of viewfinder lens that's attached to the actual lens housing, so that you get the correct aspect ratio when you're looking through the viewfinder so that you're measuring up your shots correctly. When you change the lens, and you can find some of these lenses for this camera on eBay, as you can see, when you push this button, here you can slide the lens off, and with it comes the attached correct aspect lens that attaches onto it. So that way, if you have a different lens, like I said, you can make sure that your aspect ratio is correct when you're lining up your shot. And that's actually kind of a nice feature. Otherwise, you might sort of be guessing as to how you're supposed to line your shot. The other thing is that it does have some general exposure guide data written on here. It can expose, for this particular lens, anywhere, and I think all the lenses made for this camera, anywhere from 1.9 to 16. And if we zoom in here, I can show you some of the writing. It kind of guides you, depending on what the weather is or what the lighting conditions are, where to put your f-stop. I will say that one of the things you should really note when you're thinking about what lens opening you need is that this camera, when it came out in 1930, took film that was usually at the highest an ISO 50. Most films are ISO 25 or lower. So these guides, for example, it's telling you on a dark day or in deep shade to open up to looks like 2.8 or maybe even 1.9, or an intense brightness, an f16. That may not be small enough depending on what speed film you have. This camera, like most 16mm amateur home movie cameras, you want to you're going to be exposing for a shutter speed of about 1/30th of a second or somewhere around there. So just pay attention to that. And again, unless you're using a film that's an ISO 50 or lower, I really wouldn't follow the instructions here. Use a meter, and that's going to give you a better exposure. In addition, it also has the ability to look through a waist viewfinder. That's this here. You may notice that on a lot of older still cameras, where you hold this at waist level and you can look through the viewfinder. You've got a footage counter that's going to show you how much film you have left. On the other side, you have your winder. This is a wind-up camera, so there's a spring motor in there that you wind this lever, and that's going to give you the power that the motor needs. Essentially, you wind this until you start to feel a little bit of resistance, and then you stop. Here we have the shutter release, so that's going to make the movie camera go. And this button here, when I press this button and then push down the lever again, you'll notice it's a lot slower, and that's shooting at 8 frames per second. Loading the film, I think, is really the only complicated part of using this camera. To do it, you need to open up the side of the camera. You're going to slide this, you're going to turn this button, slide it over to open, and that's going to take the top off. This is where your empty spool will go, and you see there's a lever here so that you could load it with a 50-foot spool of double perforated 16mm film, or a 100-foot spool of 16mm double perforated film. The top part of your sprocket, this is where the double perforated film becomes really important. So if you look, let's see if we can zoom in here. If you look at that spool there, as you can see, it's got 2 rows of sprockets. It's got one up here and one back there. So you need to use double perforated film, because if you only used single perforated film, one side of the film is not going to sit correctly as it's moving through the camera at this point. And I'll show you a second point where it's going to get caught up again in a second. Some people, because double perforated film, until the FPP started stocking it, was kind of tough to find, would take this spool out, this sprocket spool out, file down one side of the sprockets, and install it, and then that way you could use a single perforated film. You can do that if you feel mechanically inclined, or I just recommend that you shoot double perforated film. It's just easier, and you don't run the chance of breaking your camera or not being able to put it back together again. So that's the sort of front mechanism. You're probably asking where the full spool of film goes. Well, it's actually pretty cool. It's kept behind here. If you look, there's a little lever down here, a little button. You depress that, pull up, and here's where your full roll of film is going to go. It's going to sit back there and come up. And what you need to do is make sure that when the film comes in contact with the film gate, that the emulsion side is facing the lens. Alright, so what's the emulsion side? It's actually very easy to figure out. So the film will be wound on a spool like this. You'll notice one side of it is shiny. It's black and shiny, it might be gray and shiny, but it's shiny. The other side of the film is got like a matte finish on it. In this case, because it's a color film, it's brown. This brown matted side is the emulsion side, and that needs to be facing the lens to be exposed properly. That means we need to make sure that the film is loaded like this. So when it comes up and through the back end here, the emulsion side is up. So we'll insert the film there. Okay. And we're going to kind of keep this pulled up so it can go over the spool. Alright, so it's sort of looping over this spool here, which is kind of hard to see, but there's a spool. Again, we have the emulsion face side up, so that when it comes over here and goes to the lens, the emulsion side will be facing the lens. First thing we need to do then is clip it into the first part of the sprocket spool. This mechanism helps keep the film onto the sprocket, so if you lift this, this little sort of pin thing up, you can actually move this whole arm upwards, so that'll allow you to put the film in there. So we're going to give it a little bit of leeway. I'm going to pull out, I don't know, about half a foot of film. I'm going to insert it over the sprocket spool, and I'm going to make sure that it's that the sprockets are fitting into the holes on the film. There we go. And then all I need to do is push this lever down, and it's locked into place. You'll notice that on the camera body, there's these white guidelines, and that's to keep the loop, it's called a loop, that's to keep enough space on either top of the film gate so that the film doesn't get jammed and it flows smoothly. So you want to follow that and keep the loop the size of the loop guidelines. So this gets a little tricky, but there you go. So you flip the loop over. Okay, there's a pressure plate. This pressure plate keeps the film flat against this plane here so that the film is nice and smooth. So you just kind of push that over so you can fit the film inside. Push it down. So I've got it nice and flush in there. And then you'll notice it doesn't want to go here. That's because there's these claws, these perforation claws, that help bring the film down as it's moving through the camera. All you need to do is just push them out of the way. Push your film down into the gate. Make sure your loop at the top is nice and following the guideline. And let the claw go. So now you've got it loaded all the way to the second loop. So we're just going to make another loop again and open the bottom part of this clamp. So now we can insert the film into the bottom part of the sprocket spool, making sure that the loop is staying at the right size. Fit it into one of the sprockets and then just clamp it down. So now the film is loaded. I need to run a little bit. As you see, I didn't give myself enough play, so I need to let it run a little bit so that it comes out and I can actually insert it into the empty spool. So I'll just run the camera a little bit and you'll see the film will move through. Beautiful. All right. By the way, you don't need to do this in complete darkness. You should do it in a little bit of shade, but it doesn't need to be completely dark. This is going to be your sort of like a leader anyway. So you could, if you're really proficient at this, you could do it in a dark room so that you can get even more frames out of your film. But you know, this stuff is basically leader anyway, so I wouldn't be too worried about it. So now we need to load the film onto the empty reel. I've got an empty daylight spool. It's important that you have an empty daylight spool. And if you don't know what a daylight spool is, it's essentially a metal spool that is usually metal, sometimes plastic, that is completely black and solid on either side. That's so that light doesn't get into the film when you take this spool out and put it in your envelope or send it to your processor. So make sure that you have a daylight spool in your camera. Usually there'll be an empty one in there from the last time somebody used it. You'll notice there's an arrow on the camera body, and that's telling you what direction the spool is moving in. So obviously when we load it back onto the daylight spool, we want to load it just like it came off the camera. The emulsion side should be facing inside the spool, so that the non-emulsion side, or the base side, the shiny side, is showing when the spool is wound. So you see when the spool will be finished, the shiny side will be out, and that's how you want to load it. Put the empty reel back in there. We're going to go ahead and run the camera a little bit more so we make sure it's going on and it's not falling off. And now we're ready to go. We're going to put our cover back on, lock it, and now you're ready to shoot your 16mm movie. You'll notice the counter should now be reset. In this particular model, it counts down, so basically what you would need to do is run the camera until it reaches the pointer, which is right there, reaches 100, and that means you're actually ready to start. Anything you shoot before this 100 mark is probably going to be leader from when you spooled the camera. So once it reaches 100, you're actually ready to start taking your movies, and that'll wind down all the way to 0. You'll hear the film sort of run out of the camera when it's finished as well, so you'll know when you need to take the film out and either put fresh film in or send it to the processor. And that's it. Again, double perforated 16 millimeter film for this particular model. You can purchase it at the FPP online store. There's a couple different, there will be a couple different emulsions available, including a 50 ASA double perforated film that would be perfect for this camera. But again, you know, as long as you have a meter, you could absolutely shoot a 100 ASA film in here, or even up to a 500 ASA film, depending on the lighting conditions. If you're worried about having too much light and you want to use a high ASA film, let's say like a 500 ISO, ASA, ISO, it's the same thing. You may want to get a neutral density filter, which is basically like a grayish filter that you'd have to hold over the lens, and that kind of restricts the amount of light. It won't affect your the color of the film, whether it's black and white film or color. It won't affect the color when it's finished. You can purchase those online for pretty cheap. Again, they don't make one specific for this lens, but you could just buy, for example, a 52 millimeter neutral density filter and just hold it over the lens as you shoot. Otherwise, stick to low ASA films like 50 or 100. That's it for the Cine-Kodak Model K. I hope you enjoyed watching this. If you have questions, certainly get in touch. Hopefully this will spark you to use a 16 millimeter camera and buy some double perforated film and really experience home movie making for yourself.